Modern History Criminology interview with Professor Miklos Levay. Dear Miklos, it is really good to sit in this room of Budapest University, while on the other side of the door, the annual conference of the European Society of Criminology is happening. Let me shortly introduce you, at least concerning your most important former and present position. You have been the head of the Department of Criminology at the Budapest University, Faculty of Law, Budapest, Hungary, from 2004. You have been, you became a judge at the Constitutional Court of Hungary in 2007. You served as a president of the European Society of Criminology from 2009 and 2012. This year, you were elected for the position of the chairperson of the advisory board of the European Institution for Crime Prevention and Control. You had been the vice rector at the Budapest University, Budapest between 2006 and 2007, and you had been the dean of the Faculty of Law of Miskolc 2000 and 2004. In medias res, what's your feeling on the last day of the annual conference of the European Society of Criminology, when more than 1,000 participants gathered from all over the world and shared their results in 6 plenary and more than 220 panel sessions?
Okay, before answering your question, let me stress how important and how a privilege for me that I could be a part of the oral history series of the ASC. Just one reason. During the academic year of 1991-1992, I spent half a year at the Selling Center of the University of Pennsylvania, and my supervisor or mentor was Marvin Wolfgang. Preparing for this interview, I looked through the other interviews, and more or less I was shocked. Marvin Wolfgang, interviewer, interviewee, and other important American criminologists, for example Gerhard Müller, Frida Adler, but later I can tell you my relationship, for example, with Gerhard and Frida. Now, back to your question. I'm really glad, first of all, that this conference could be here. I was the president of the European Society of Criminology between 2009 and 2012, and my main effort was to put a conference to Budapest. So I'm glad that there is a conference, and most of the participants told me how successful this conference, not just because quantity, as you mentioned, more than 1,000 participants, but the quality of the plenary session speakers and the panels. And you know, but non-Hungarian viewers of this interview should know how difficult was the situation of criminology or the development of criminology in Hungary. For example, 40 years ago it was more or less a forbidden or pseudo-science. It was labeled as a pseudo-science. And now we have department, we have a master program, and we have this wonderful conference.
And how did you become involved in criminology? Actually, you are a lawyer by education, but how did you turn to criminology in the end?
When I was a student between 1975 and 1980, criminology was just an obligatory course at the law school curriculum. And I was a law student, and so it was a one-term obligatory course. That's all. However, fortunately, there was a very big, very strong, not department, it's some kind of division of criminology inside the Department of Criminal Procedure Law. And with really nice teachers, I should emphasize Professor Katalin Gönzöl. At that time, she was a young, dynamic as today, teacher of criminology, and she was the head of a special student group. The Hungarian name of this group in English, a scientific student circle, which means if you are interested in much more a given subject, like me interested in criminology, you can get more than the normal curricula. And I was a second-year student when we started to learn criminal law, and I realized, okay, criminal law is interesting because I can knowledge about what a criminal offense is. But I realized that I would be interested in why we have crime in the society. So, and I joined this student circle when we could get more knowledge about criminology, and the point was we could work as some kind of volunteer probation officer. And I started to work, and I worked with 2 juvenile delinquent boys. I worked with them for 2 years, and after I decided I'm writing the thesis in criminology, and it was an empirical research. I spent a week in the juvenile facility, actually a juvenile prison, and I made so-called deep interview with 70 inmates, because in the Hungarian legal term, juvenile inmates. So, and okay, that was the background. So I wanted to know more crime than I have knowledge from the criminal law.
I understand. But do you imagine 30 years ago that you would be the head of the department where you started your research work as a student?
Oh, no, absolutely not. And I was invited to the department because in 1979 a criminology department was founded at this faculty, and I was invited to the faculty. However, you know, it's an interesting time in Hungary. There is different names of that period, the period before 1990. Soft dictatorship, Kádár regime, communist time, and so on. Now the story is I was invited to the department, and after the graduation ceremony, I was asked to give an interview, a Hungarian daily newspaper, about my life as a young lawyer who was invited to a department, a fresh intellectual, okay. And I in some way criticized the system in a very weak way. It's difficult to find a job, it's difficult to create a stable financial situation, a young man, and so on. It was more or less 5 sentences which had some critical content. And the dean decided this guy couldn't come to the faculty because he's criticized the system, and we didn't need that kind of new teacher. I was frustrated, I must say, and actually nobody protected me, nobody saved me, that I didn't have any more problem. I started to work the prosecutor service, and however, in 1 year later, my teachers from this university suggested me to a new law faculty, a Miskolc, and I could start as a criminal law and criminology teacher 1981, but not in Hungary, not in Budapest and not at the altar, but at the University of Miskolc.
What influenced your choices for formal education and training?
Do you mean why I went to...
Yeah.
Why
you left from the prosecutor service
okay,
and to become a
yes.
teacher at university?
Yes, because I am much more theoretical oriented lawyer. Today might be not just lawyer, but also criminologist. And then, so it was interesting, the junior prosecutor work, but it was boring for me. I'm sorry for those prosecutors.
Okay. Could you mention a person or persons you consider as your mentor?
First of all, as I mentioned, Eva Inzelt, she helped me a lot during my student time, and she suggested me the dean of the new law faculty, which I mentioned at the University of Miskolc. And later, when a young head of the department, Professor István Tauber, passed away 2003, and she invited me to the department and to the faculty. So I came back this faculty 2004 and helped me Katalin Güntzel. And it's interesting, I have, and fortunately, I have many foreign mentors. I mentioned Marvin Wolfgang. I spent 5 months at the Selling Center, and I learned a lot from Marvin Wolfgang. I participated his classes, courses, and in that time I was working my PhD dissertation, so more or less I completed. But I was really surprised that the criminology is not the same as we saw in Hungary or the continental Europe. So in that time I saw criminology mainly a policy-oriented subject. I learned from Marvin Wolfgang that criminology is a research-oriented discipline, not simply a policy-oriented. I remember how he was enthusiastic when he was talking about his former research, for example, the Philadelphia cohort study and another empirical research. Okay, another American mentor, Gerhard Müller. I spent the academic year of 1993-1994 in the School of Criminal Justice, the Rutgers. And Gerhard Müller and his wife Frida Adler, they were so nice with me, not just with professionally, but with as human beings, helped me a lot. You know, Eva, that we have a textbook written by Gerhard Müller, Frida Adler, and William Laufer. So in Hungary, we have the Hungarian version of the shorter version of the criminology written by the mentioned 3 excellent criminologists. So thanks to Gerhard and Frida, I got the first version and thanks to Bill Laufer, who helped me a lot in my first days and weeks in the United States. So, and I liked very much that textbook because it's completely different than we have in continental Europe and in Hungary. Much more readable, but scientifically fair and correct. And I pushed a publishing company, we should need the Hungarian version something, I could get this book and we could the opportunity, it would be a Hungarian version of that book. So later, not just talking about American mentors, Hans-Jörg Albrecht, the director of the Max Planck Institute in Freiburg, helped me a lot, has helped me a lot. We have a really good contact, and I spent actually half a year in Belgium at the Catholic University in Louvain-la-Neuve, and in that time the head of the Department of Criminal Law and Criminology was Professor Françoise Dulkens, who later became a judge of the European Court of Human Rights. I learned from her how important the human rights issue when we are talking about and dealing with criminal justice and dealing with offenders and crime. Okay, I wouldn't like to forget anybody, but of course my Hungarian career helped a lot. András Szabó, who was a member of the Constitutional Court, unfortunately he passed away a couple of years ago, but he was an excellent criminologist. Unfortunately, actually, he doesn't have English language publication. He could speak French fluently, so he has some French language publication, but unfortunately the English-speaking community of the criminologists don't know him. And Denis Szabó. Denis Szabó, a Hungarian-born criminologist, who is the founding father of the School of Law in Montreal. He helped me a lot.
Okay. Criminology is a quite broad field of science. In which areas have you been particularly interested in? You mentioned already that your master thesis dealt with the social background of the juvenile inmates. What was the reason that you chose another topic, namely the drug criminal law and drug criminality in Hungary, and in a comparative perspective as a PhD team?
Yeah, drug situation, drug problem, was a completely new phenomenon in Hungary in the late 1980s. For my generation, the drug problem was drinking too much alcohol. But the next generation tried to different sorts of drugs, but not real drugs, glue sniffing. That was a horrible deviant behavior among the young generation, as I mentioned, in the late 1980s. And I wanted to deal with a new topic. I wanted to know the epidemiological situation, and I wanted to do research on drug policy. How can we deal with a rational way this question? The first year it was difficult to deal with this topic because it was a more or less forbidden topic, the drug. It's enough for Hungary crime, alcohol, suicide and so on, and the political leaders didn't want to accept that the typical Western style deviance came to Hungary. But the second half of the 80s in Hungary was completely different than the first half. So I must say I didn't have any political barrier or problem with dealing with. But so the motivation was to get to know the situation in Hungary in the field of drug problem. So, and it was a criminological PhD on drug problem.
What kind of results have you found?
Yes, just a minute. I made some kind of questionnaire survey, I studied roughly 600 court files, offenders who were sentenced drug offenses, drug use. Okay, but the most important finding was for me, and I think in that time it was interesting, that there is no relationship, and there is no causal relationship between drug use and crime. And the second, that the drug problem in Hungary, mainly taking drugs, not the illegal trafficking. And the third one, it was legal research, a comparative research. How about the regulation and the criminal law and criminal justice about drug problem in different countries? I studied the United States, the Netherlands, and Germany. How about the legal and criminal law situation? And I think in some way I could contribute to the legislation and the modification of the penal code in 1993 based on my comparative research. For example, the first time in Hungary the diversion was introduced in the penal code concerning drug users. Diversion from the criminal justice into the social services and medical treatment. And I was some kind of expert of drafting this part of the regulation and the rule of section of the penal code.
Okay. It's really interesting. If you are follow, you're right. We are in the middle of 1990s, and I think it was quite surprised lots of your colleagues that at that time you wrote a chapter in a Hungarian criminology textbook appeared in 1996, and your chapter title was "The Development of the Criminological Thinking in Hungary." What arose your interest regarding this topic?
So it was a surprise for me when the two other editors of the textbook asked me to write the chapter on the history of Hungarian criminology. So before answering the question, you should know that in Hungary, in that time, actually we didn't have a nice and good textbook in criminology. It was we had some sort of textbook, but the first version of that textbook, written in just a minute, actually the first version in the late 1960s, and it was a modified version in 1970s, and the final one 1983. But in the middle of 1990, the Hungarian criminology and the Hungarian criminologists had much more knowledge, which you could get from the mentioned textbook. That textbook was important. It is important for the students who learned criminology in the 60s, 70s and the 80s. But it was not enough in the 1995, 1996. And Katalin Göncöl and László Korinek, who is the criminologist and head of the Department of Criminology at the University of Pécs, decided, okay, we should need a new and a large textbook in criminology, and I was asked. They didn't want to write a historical chapter, and I was enthusiastic and happy, because in this way I could go back to the history of criminology, and I could show up for the students and for the community of the Hungarian criminologists that the criminology in Hungary start in the late 1950s. It started actually the last decade of the 19th century, and I loved to read the old criminological texts written by very smart criminal lawyers. Let me just add one sentence, a foreword for a criminal law book written by a Hungarian criminologist, Mr. Van Beri, in 1913. This criminal law textbook is completely other than the other criminal law textbook. Why other? Because I give you information, I give the students information, a new subject of the criminal sciences, criminology. And so that was more or less the first really criminological publication in Hungary, and I love to read the old text, and I was surprised how my that time colleagues knew everything about the word, that word. Lombroso, Gary, Quackley, Gabriel Tard. So all of the criminologists who did study criminology in that time, you could read and you could get information from that text. And it was new for me. I thought the criminology started at the late 1950s.
Oh.
And just a minute, and I discovered for the Hungarian criminology a new person, István Schäfer, who was actually was the final or last criminology professor before starting the communist regime in 1949. He was a teacher and professor of criminology at this university until 1948, and he was an absolutely smart person. Unfortunately, he left the country, and later he became known as Stephen Schäfer. So, as a retribution and restorative justice, another area and victimology, which he did study.
And of course, white collar crime.
Sorry, yes, you are an expert in white collar crime. You know better than me how Stephen Schäfer was the first expert in Hungary this topic. Thanks.
Yeah. What was the situation of the subject criminology itself after the socialist dictatorship and after the change of regime in Hungary?
Yes, as I mentioned, how nice was the criminology and the old criminologist, the late 19th century. But unfortunately, in 1949, the criminology was labeled by the communist dictatorship as a pseudoscience. And the reason was that in the socialist regime, there is no social background of the criminality. That's why we didn't need that kind of subject. So it was an ideology-oriented aspect about crime and criminal justice. So it was a pseudo criminology during the 1950s. Unfortunately, when the so-called soft dictatorship started after the 1956 revolution, it was accepted that crime, criminality is the part of the society. It doesn't matter what kind of society, so-called socialist one or capitalist one. If we are living in a society, crime is a social phenomenon, is part of our life. And at that time, political regime accepted, okay, criminology could be a discipline. And teaching criminology started 1963, and all of the law faculties in that time, we had 3 law faculties in the country, in Hungary.
Okay, and the approach of the government or the ruling parties has changed after the transition?
Yeah, absolutely. There was no ideological or political question. Criminology, crime is another situation. The first years of the transition period, the crime was not a political question. It's interesting because the crime increasing very dynamically. Let me just give you an example. The registered crime was in 1988 roughly 200,000. 1992, 2 years after changing the regime, the number of registered crime was around 400,050, so doubled. But the first modification or amendment of the penal code was a really liberal, rational and human one. It was a modification or amendment of the penal code, was a part of the public administration dealing with crime. It's not a political question. That was the first years of the transition period, but it's ended this situation roughly in 1995.
Okay. Listening to your answer, as far as the transition concerned, it is quite evident for me that what you started to investigate the effects of the change of the system after 1990. Since then, both the political and the economic environment changed in a drastically way. It was a real challenge for the academic players in that field. And how could you describe your feeling at the time?
Absolutely. You know that you don't know because in that time you just were a secondary school girl. So, but if you look back, most of the titles of the Hungarian criminological publications, you can find the following words: social changes, transition and social changes and crime, transitional justice. So most of the more or less every Hungarian criminologist deal with how influence the social changes, the crime situation, and first just the crime situation, later the criminal justice, development of criminal justice. And of course the second question, how can we explain? How can we explain? This is the price of the so-called price of the freedom, or we could find a deeper explanation or reasons. For example, from the opportunity theory, because there is more opportunity, more goods, more services, which give opportunity for committing crimes. Or how about the social inequality? Because we have a very big gap between, from the point of view of income division or income distribution inside the population. We have a very big gap between the first 10% and the lowest one. So how this new kind of inequality contribute the crime situation? How about the poverty? And how about the homeless situation? So today is very rich, the literature of how the social changes influence the crime situation. And the new area, how these changes influence on the penal legislation, the criminal policy, the penal policy. I'm a little bit disappointed what's going anyone in the field of criminal justice, because the first years of the transition period, we wanted to follow the Western patterns of the criminal justice, and this, for example, to stop the imprisonment-centered sentencing practice. Before 1990, roughly every second sentence was imprisonment, and half of them non-conditional. Okay, but a few years later, it's decreased 30%, or the non-custodial sanction, non-custodial imprisonment was 10% in the year of 1993, 1994. So, however, later, it was when the crime situation and the criminal policy and criminal and penal policy legislation politicized. We should say a punitive term took place. Roughly the second half of the 1990s and mainly 2010. So today, just a minute, the prison population rate during the socialist time, the socialist countries had a very high prison population rate, high comparing with Western European countries, more than 200. However, in Hungary, the prison population rate in 1995 was around 120, 140. But now in June this year, 186, which is a direction back to the socialist time. That's why, for example, in this field there is two different aspects. How we can explain this situation in the field of criminal justice, politicization of criminal law legislation and criminal policy, and the high imprisonment rate. One opinion represented by my Polish friend Krzysztof Krajewski, that this is the heritage of the communist past. It's my opinion, no, the new politicians like politicization of penal policy issue, which is in a parliamentary democracy is a good advantage for getting more votes. So it's a governing through crime phenomenon. We know in Hungary we have new experience in this field.
Besides your academic career in criminology, you have always remained a lawyer. We have seen that you have quite a lot of experiences on different fields of criminology and law. When you look back, what are the contribution or achievement of which you are most proud?
Okay. The one thing is an institutional one, establishing the master program in criminology. This university, actually, our department has a master's program in criminology, started 2011. I'm really proud of this program because in this way I hope criminology could be an adult discipline on the social sciences in Hungary, and criminologist could be a job because I have to share this kind of pride with my colleagues, for example with you,
Thank you.
and the members of the department, because this was a common work, this is a common work, but I was the department and I pushed my colleagues, we should do this one. So, as a criminologist, as a researcher, I think it was the drug research was important. Not because that was the first one. Maybe in that research has some quality, it could be replicated, and the other thing is, as a legal scholar, the comparative aspect and comparative attitude, the areas which I deal with, drug law, drug criminal law, juvenile justice, and penal policy. I try to pursue it and try to do a comparative aspect. I think this cannot be neglected in Hungary, because we are a small country with an exotic language between East and West, so it's useful and it's necessary to get to know what's going on around the world. So if you read my drug criminality and drug criminal law book, or publications, for example, on juvenile justice and Hungarian penal policy, you can find more or less in every paper a comparative analysis. So, and I'm proud, this is a personal one, that I think I tried to help the most talented students' life, and the younger scholars, younger PhD scholars' future and development. To recommend his, her, them for scholarship programs and going to abroad. So and I'm really happy that our department is a vivid department. Actually, every member of the staff well known, not just inside Hungary but outside Hungary. This is not my merit, but some way I can contribute to this situation.
You mentioned the importance of the comparative perspective in research. So can we consider it as an advice for young scholars that the comparative perspective is and will be something that's worth to deal with?
Absolutely. So, as you know, because of my legal background and lawyer background, at the same time I'm doing criminological research and research in the field of penal policy. So, if a young scholar would like to be a criminologist, he or she, I absolutely would recommend his or her methodological knowledge. So doing research in the field of criminology or in any field of social, any other field of social sciences, couldn't imagine without a nice methodological knowledge. Okay. field of criminal law, criminal justice, penal policy. But of course, the first thing is learning foreign languages. Today, without English, I don't think anybody could doing research in the field of criminology or legal studies. In our situation, I mean our cultural situation, I mean Hungary, I think it should learn German because we have strong connection with the German culture, Austrian and German culture. We had common history, and okay, these two languages. It's absolute important doing research in this time. So, and going abroad, beginning of his or her career. I wouldn't say it doesn't matter, because it's important that not just going abroad, it's important the institution. It's going abroad and doing research or getting knowledge in a nice and good and really quality institution, university or research institution. And that is what I would suggest the younger Hungarian generation.
What do you think, or what kind of expectation do you have the development of the Hungarian criminology in the next, I don't know, 5 or 10 years?
So, we say in Hungary, in this type of question, this is a difficult question, but good question. I try to combine the knowledge and experience which I get in the Constitutional Court, as a Constitutional Court judge, the constitutional aspects of social problem or legal situation, and my knowledge in the field of criminology, particularly in the field of penal policy and the development of penal policy in Hungary. So I would like to do research in the near future about what's going on in Hungary after the changing the regime in the field of penal policy, in the comparative aspects, compare with those countries around Hungary where the same kind of social changes took place, mainly in Poland, Slovenia, Czech Republic, because the level of the development, these countries more or less the same.
Okay. I'm sure that the life story, experiences and advices of an outstanding Hungarian professor will be interesting for the people dealing with criminology and even for the more general audience. So thank you very much for the interview.
Thank you indeed.